perspective presented by the New Orleans Secular Humanist Association, following our few principles of humanism.
We're committed to the use of science and reason for understanding the universe and for solving human problems. We're skeptical of untested claims of knowledge, but we're open to new ideas.
We are concerned with securing justice and fairness in society and in ending intolerance and discrimination. We are committed to the total separation of religion and government.
We affirm humanism as a realistic alternative to the theologies of despair and the ideologies of violence. We reject the concept of an afterlife and believe in living a full and rewarding life here and now.
We value and respect each individual's right to judge and lead their lives according to their own position, as long as it's respectful of other people, living in a free society.
We hope you enjoy today's program and others in the weeks to follow. Hello, folks. Welcome back again. I'm Harry Greenberger, host for this show, and we have a very interesting guest today. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Chris W. Surprenant. He is assistant professor of philosophy at the University of New Orleans, where he directs the Alexis de Tocqueville Project in Law, Liberty, and Morality. We'll talk about that later. His work focuses on the intersection of morality, religion, and politics. All of the things that well-mannered people are not supposed to talk about at the dinner table. Specifically, he examines the nature of virtue, what an individual must do to become virtuous, and the role of family, community, and state in moral education. He teaches the history of philosophy, moral philosophy, political philosophy, and the philosophy of education. Non-historical courses focus on the intersection of law, liberty, and morality, virtue and how it can be acquired, and what it means for individuals to live a good life and how they can realize this goal. I'm going to talk to you about the word good. But I do want to say that in the year 2012, he was recognized by the Princeton Review as one of the best 300 professors in the United States, and for that we all congratulate you.
Thank you.
Let me say that we as secular humanists, having been convinced that this is the only life we're going to have, there's no afterlife, what we're in now is not a dress rehearsal for the future. This is it. Therefore, we say, let's make the most of it. Let's live rich, rewarding, fulfilling lives, so long as at the same time we don't deprive other people of doing the same thing. Now, for each of us attempting to fulfill our lives, our lives may not be the same. We may have different methods of achieving what we consider a full life, which is what takes me to your statement that you say what it means for individuals to live a good life. What is good?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, so if you look at the history of philosophy, Aristotle gives you a really interesting answer as to how people ought to live their lives or what they should value. And Aristotle gives us three different types of values or goods that people could pursue. So he identifies them as different types of virtues. So you have the intellectual virtues or virtues of knowledge. You have moral virtues that are virtues of character. And then you have some other types of values that allow people to acquire the intellectual and moral virtues. And so intellectual virtues would be things like knowledge of science, knowledge of the natural world, or in some Aristotle translations, knowledge of the unchanging world. Whereas his moral virtues are character virtues, so things like being brave or courageous or generous. And the thing with Aristotle, which I think you would like or appreciate, is that for Aristotle, especially with the moral virtues, he says that the spheres of what is noble and just admit of a great deal of variation, so that they seem to exist, they seem to exist sort of where we kind of identify the bounds of them. So we would say that maybe the courageous fireman would demonstrate courage in a different way than the courageous teacher or the courageous mother. And so what you can get is you can get a type of moral or value pluralism, where what ends up getting rejected are things on the extremes. So we could point out something and say that this particular behavior or this particular value is not good. It's not a way to live a good life. But that there's a wide range of values or a wide range of behaviors that could be considered good. So it's not necessarily about picking out one particular way of living that's good, but rather that there's more of a range, I think. And I think Aristotle's approach is quite right in many ways. It's very difficult, and I certainly wouldn't say that there's only one way that people could live good lives.
I understand much of what you just said. Now, still, I'm back to the word good, the opposite of which is either bad or evil or not good. I don't know how, in your definition of good, what the opposite is. But are you saying that there's more than one good and you can select among the goods, or is there a positive good?
Well, I think for all individuals, cultivating one's talents and cultivating one's capacities to their fullest possible extent would be consistent with living a good life. So someone who, for example, spends their day sitting in front of the couch watching Jerry Springer and eating Cheetos all day wouldn't be living a good life. They're not cultivating their, yeah.
All right. But that person, by his own definition, may say, this is the life, eating these Cheetos and watching TV. I mean, is it not relative? Is there a positive good as opposed to, a relative good?
Well, I'm not really sure that person would be making an intelligent decision about what constitutes a good life. I think one of the things that you see in the history of philosophy is important emphasis placed on having a wide range of experiences. And then it's that person who's experiencing many things who's able to judge best. So the person who, for example, has been sitting on the couch and watching television, has he or she experienced other things, and is he or she in an appropriate position to judge whether or not what they're doing is best, even if they prefer it. So one of the things we do, or I do with my students, is say, well, would you trade your life for the life of Barkley, my dog? Barkley lives, by all accounts, a pretty good life. He's well fed, he gets to look out the window all day. Would you make the trade? And most of my students say, of course not. And I say, well, why? Are there times when you're unhappy? And they go, well, yes, but my life is also more rewarding, more fulfilling. And I think that's the problem, that the challenge is, let's say you've had all those experiences. So let's say you've done all these wonderful things. You're like Aristotle. You've spent time in the library. You've spent time cultivating your moral virtues, right? You've become brave and generous. And then at the end of the day, you say, you know what? I just want to sit on the couch, watch Jerry Springer and eat Cheetos. That's my idea of a good life. I don't know what to say to that person.
Well, if you go to the religious perspective, good means not committing sins, as I understand it.
Okay.
A good religious person, a good Christian, is one who obeys whatever the teachings are. That person may be without sin, but without any of these more challenging and interesting things that you just mentioned. Is that still a good life?
I don't know. I mean, this is one of the problems of mixing goodness and religion, as you're probably well aware of. So in Plato's Euthyphro dialogue, one of the central questions is something good because God says it's good, or does God say it's good because it's good? So is there something central to those things we recognize as being good that makes them good in themselves, irrespective of whether or not God or some sort of divine entity says that they're good? Or is good behavior good because it's written in the Bible, or because it's written in the Torah, or because it's written in some holy book? And you get to the end of the dialogue, and I think with most individuals, when you push them, things are good because there's something about those things inherently that makes them good, not because of some sort of religious life. So if you were to tell me, well, does the person who lives without sin, are they living a good life? Well, I would need to ask you more. What are the sorts of things they value? Why do they value them? If the reason I live without sin is because on Sunday my preacher is telling me how to live my life, and I follow my preacher's instructions to the T, I don't think that person's living a good life. I don't think that person's not making free decisions. He or she's handed over their freedom to someone else.
But does then living a good life depend upon what someone from the outside defines as good? Cannot each individual decide for himself what good means?
To a certain extent, I think. I think that when there are going to be certain principles, I think, that are going to be tough to violate. So if I were some sort of sociopath, and I said, well, what I really want to do, or what I really enjoy doing, or what I really value doing is killing or causing harm to a lot of people or a lot of things. There's something about that's not quite right, and we can get into why. And so one of the aims of moral philosophy is to come up with a system of ethics or system of values. And there are lots of different alternatives, or lots of different ways to get at that. And I think one of the biggest problems that we see with someone that the type of people you identify is that there often isn't a consistency with what they value.
I have a question, because I have not been able to differentiate between morality and ethics, except that I think morality must be connected to religion. I'm not sure of that, but how do you distinguish between morality and ethics?
So in some ways, I think that's just a linguistic distinction, and I'm not sure it depends on how you define morality and ethics. One of the ways that I like to look at it is a difference between moral philosophy and ethics. And I'm not sure, again, that's a distinction that's anything more than just words, but I like to think of moral philosophy as thinking about the nature of morality and moral principles, whereas when I think of ethics, I like to think of, well, how do you apply those principles to the world, to particular events?
All right. Now, who determines those principles?
Well, it depends on who you ask. So if you're a utilitarian, the principle is that we ought to provide the greatest amount of happiness or the greatest amount of well-being to the greatest number of people. If you're a Kantian, then it's going to be reason-based, that what I ought to do is I ought to perform the actions that are consistent with reason. So something, or having beliefs that are logically contradictory, for example, believing that both the sky is blue and not blue at the same time is inconsistent with reason. And one of the things you can see with Kant is that it's not the same sort of logical contradiction with morality, but not lying then would be inconsistent with reason. I'm willing something that in some sense can't be universalized.
Well, we secular humanists have what we would consider a set of moral principles which are not handed down from on high, as most people's morals are. Our position is that experience, our own and our historic experience, has shown that certain actions have detrimental results for humans, mm-hmm. and maybe for humanity, and others produce beneficial results. And so if you do the ones that work out well and don't do the ones that work out badly, that would be a code of morality. Not the same as religious morality. Now, you're teaching these topics. In fact, I'm looking at one of your recent talks, morality, religion, and the law. What did you say at that talk?
I think one of the challenges when you look at the law is distinguishing between morality and the law. So just because something is legal or illegal doesn't make that behavior moral or immoral. And so one of the things that I was doing in that particular talk is talking about the nature of the state, when the state should get involved in the lives of individuals, why we may want to allow people to perform actions that we think are immoral. So if there's a set of actions that I think is immoral, so what's something in the news recently? Something like same-sex marriage, for instance, that my views may or may not say that same-sex marriage is immoral. But I also may say, well, it's not the appropriate role of the state to enforce morality, that what the state's there for is to prevent harms. And so in the case of same-sex marriage, for instance, someone could say, well, even though I recognize same-sex marriage or those sorts of sexual relations as being immoral, I wouldn't make it illegal because it's really not harming anyone in the way that the state should prevent.
Well, should the religious people who are opposed to many things that the non-religious people find acceptable, and also produce a lot of the laws which make things illegal, are they wrong in doing that?
You're asking me for my personal opinion on whether or not...
Well, your opinion or your professorial opinion, either one.
Well, so answering as a professor, I would run you through a list of different moral theories. As a person who's been looking at these issues, yeah, I don't think that's the right way to go. I think that the state exists for other reasons. And one of the problems is, or one of the challenges of a state is to get people with varying opinions or varying views on issues of morality to live together in relative peace at the same time while we're trying to maximize everyone's liberty. And so under those circumstances, I don't think it's right to introduce certainly religious understandings of morality into the law. But if you have something like, right, why is it wrong for me to kill you? Well, it's a liberty violation in a certain sense. It's not that I'm sinning.
I think murder of innocent people has been considered wrong, immoral, whatever, through the centuries and by religious and non-religious people. But when you get to, I think in and of itself, killing an innocent person can't be justified.
That's right. But if I can interject, is the reason why it's wrong because it's a liberty violation and causes harm to someone else, or is the reason why it's wrong is because God says thou shalt not kill?
Oh, you just asked the right question. Now answer your own question.
Well, I think it's the first, right? I think it's a liberty violation.
Right.
And so when you were talking about the moral views of the secular humanists, you're looking at a consequentialist moral theory, that we're looking at outcomes, which I think is an interesting way or a reasonably good way of looking at it.
All right. Well, now, along those lines, in our present times that we're living now, it is the people with the religious set of morality who are making and enforcing our laws locally, statewide, and nationally. We have in the state of Louisiana, they get almost unanimous votes for matters that are clearly unconstitutional. And for the federal government, they haven't been able to do anything because there are those highly religious people who just draw a line and say we aren't going to agree to anything. And since you are, tell me, this may be in some way really connected to your Tocqueville Project in Law, Liberty, and Morality. What is that?
So one of the things that the Tocqueville Project was set up to examine is to look at what I call enduring questions in the history of Western moral and political thought. So some of those questions that you open the program with. What is the appropriate relationship between religion and politics? Or what is the appropriate role of the state in directing people towards the good life, for instance? And I think it becomes a little bit more complicated than just saying, well, look, religious people want to live their lives in this way. Can they impose their views on other people? I think it's a little bit more complicated than that, because what we want to say is, if there are ways of living your life, or anyone living their lives, or decisions they can make that we know are obviously bad, and not necessarily obviously bad because they harm other people, but obviously bad because they're detrimental to that person and his or her well-being, is it the appropriate role of the state in either directing them towards a better way of living their life, or at the very least, directing them away from bad decisions? And so I think there's a really important difference. So when you look at types of theocracies, that what you have is you have the state directing people not away from bad things, but toward a particular conception of the good life and a particular way that individuals are able to live their lives. But you could also see, or also have a state where it's not so much that we direct people toward a particular conception of the good life, but we direct them away from particular bad lives, and then give them an adequate range from which they can choose what sort of life they want to live. So take, for instance, a very particular example. Think of something like a state law that mandates breathalyzers in automobiles. And so people, my libertarian friends, would say, I know you had Walter Block on the show not too long ago, and my libertarian friends would say, well, that's a violation of liberty because it's not the state's obligation or it's not the state's role to prevent people from harming themselves. And I'm not sure that's right, because who in their right mind, for instance, would say, I want to drive intoxicated? I mean, this seems to be a case where someone's making a choice that's irrational. So it's not like a rational decision to kill yourself when you're in an immense amount of pain, or a rational decision to take some sort of risk like skydiving. But this is an irrational situation when you've consumed too much alcohol.
You just said something about whether it's, I think you said it was irrational to kill yourself because you're in a lot of pain.
No.
Oh, you did not say that.
No. I'm drawing a distinction between someone who wants someone who's going to drive drunk, and then what may be a very rational decision to say, I want to end my life. And so if the state jumps in and when an individual is making a rational decision to end his or her life because they're in a lot of pain, that strikes me as being problematic in many cases. Whereas if the state jumps in and says, well, look, you're going to make a really bad decision. And if you weren't drunk, you wouldn't make this decision. And so we're going to make it difficult for you to...
Because you might harm others in the process.
Or you might harm yourself. I mean, this argument is about harming oneself. And the conditions under which the state can sort of try to make you a better person or make you make better decisions.
Well, you mentioned previously theocracy. Are people under theocracies, the people, are they generally happier than the ones under other forms of government?
Happiness is tough, right? Because happiness is something that in some senses can be conditioned. So we can condition a person in certain ways to be happy under certain circumstances, but I think generally when you maximize liberty, you maximize happiness and maximize well-being. So
back to our discussion of good, would you say theocracies are not good?
I would say that they're problematic, but I could also imagine lots of other somewhat problematic forms of government, and I could imagine a circumstance where a theocracy would be a better choice than many alternatives. Kind of a wishy-washy answer, but it's like anything else that you've got a range. So you look at something like democracy, and people in the United States seem to love democracy. If you open up Plato's Republic, democracy ends up being one of the bad regime forms, because what do you get in a democracy? It's essentially mob rule. Look at presidential elections. Look at all the elections. That what we do is we use rhetoric and appeal to people's desires and basically promise them things. And it's on that basis that they cast votes. So it really depends. I mean, I don't think it's as cut and dry as saying, well, theocracies are always bad, because you could have an enlightened ruler of the theocracy. Is it likely? Probably not. But
I think a benevolent dictatorship is not a bad form of government.
Well, you would agree with Plato. That's the best form of government. The problem is finding the benevolent dictator.
You're right about that. But now this de Tocqueville Project in law, liberty and morality, is that just a UNO? Does that exist in other places, or is that just a local thing?
It's a local thing for the most part, although there are a lot of other institutes and centers and university affiliates around the country that are looking at similar projects. So our project at UNO is aligned with similar programs at George Mason University and at Princeton. So it's going on all over, but the Tocqueville Project is particular to New Orleans, and right now particular to the University of New Orleans.
And what is it that you do as opposed to just being a college professor? What do you do at that?
Oh, I see. Okay, so what we also do is we host lectures, so we host seminars, student and faculty reading groups. Really, it's just being a good college professor, what most college professors should be doing. But one of the reasons why we set it up as a project is sort of to center it around a set of ideas that aren't just in philosophy, but that cross over to history and political science and economics as well. And so in many ways it's interdisciplinary. So while a philosophy department or a history department or a political science department may have reading groups or may bring in lecturers to talk about particular issues in philosophy, the goal of the project is really interdisciplinary and bringing people together in these very related fields of for the most part, philosophy, political science, and economics.
Which is what you just recently did. And the topic of that was, remind me.
It was the morality of capitalism.
Of capitalism.
Of capitalism, yes.
And did you have speakers on both sides of that question?
Well, keep in mind that there are many sides of that issue, but we had two different economists who were both in favor of capitalism. One was more of a free market, libertarian, anarcho-capitalist, and the other was more of a Keynesian capitalist. And so it wasn't that we brought on a communist or a socialist or someone along those lines, but we had two different types of capitalists on looking at, is capitalism as an economic system moral, and what are some of the problems? And so the interesting moral debate was, one of the consequences of free market capitalism is that it seems like inevitably it leads to inequalities. And one of the things that we think in this country, to some extent, or a significant extent, is that inequalities are unjust. And so if you have an economic system that will inevitably, it seems, just because of differences between people in intelligence and abilities, lead to inequalities, is there something about that system that is inherently unjust? And so our speakers, in some extent, were both defending capitalism, although the challenge is, well, how do you avoid those injustices? Or one, first, is inequality unjust? And if it is, how then do you avoid those injustices, while at the same time, if you're looking for social progress or looking for technological progress, it seems like capitalism as an economic system in practice is the best way to get there. We
are just about out of time. Did you find that the audience for that particular event were leaning one way or the other?
It's a college audience, so a lot of the students generally lean to more of a socialist leaning, I think, for the most part. I think that you have, but I think it was a pretty good mix of people with a lot of different economic backgrounds and interests, and they came there with an open mind, which is what I hope most people come to our talks with.
I would hope so, yes. Well, Chris, I want to thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me on the show.
And, I'm sure we're going to hear more from you as time goes on. We want to thank you folks for watching our show, and come back again.